Hi, my name is Lara Rusch, and I'm going to be presenting an overview of the first chapter of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. In this presentation, I'm going to review some main points from the first chapter. I will discuss examples to illuminate those points, and along the way, I am including some questions for students to think and write about in brackets. I won't be discussing those, but they'll be on the slides for your use. First, a bit on Kendi's personal story. Throughout the chapter and the book, Kendi describes his own personal process of becoming an anti-racist through facing and challenging the racist ideologies that he and experiences that he faced from being a small child to an adult historian. He beautifully and sometimes painfully analyzes his experiences of racism, and in doing so, he humanizes for all of us his process of becoming an anti-racist. I'm not going to comment further on his personal story, but I wanted to note that it is a valuable aspect and thread of the book. So as the title suggests, Kendi's work in this book is defining racism, an idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another in any way. This may seem like a straightforward definition of making assumptions about a group based on ascribed socially constructed characteristics, right? So why define it? And he's saying it's the work of the kind of people, not just an individual choice, but the kind of people we want to be collectively in the United States, and so that we can together work for consistent goals. One key aspect of racism that is unclear to Americans is the degree to which racism is understood as individually based or systemic. And so Kendi's challenging the fuzzy, unclear, and even paradoxical ways that Americans talk about racism or don't talk about, choose not to face or talk about racism. And he's arguing that until we stick to a definition, we're not going to be able to address it. So as I mentioned, Americans disagree over the causes. About an equal measure, Americans either agree that our policies and institutions are the cause of racism, or Americans focus on the role of individuals. Of course, these are not entirely mutually exclusive. Systemic causes include the prevalence of individual racist attitudes, but systemic causes are much broader and interlocking than any aggregation of individual bias. If you think that the individual attitudes are the problem, then you're thinking that the system as a whole is basically fair, and a few individuals' problematic preferences are causing disruptions for society that is otherwise working well. To explain this further, I'm going to use an example from Memorial Day 2020. You may have heard of this because it got a lot of news coverage, an incident where Christian Cooper was bird watching in Central Park, and he asked Amy Cooper, no relation, to leash her dog as required by park rules, and they exchanged words, and she warned Christian that she would call the cops to tell them, quote, there's an African-American man threatening her life. And then she did so, and he filmed it, and as she called the police and told them that, and he posted the video, and it became a national incident. So she went on national news then and sort of apologized, saying, I'm not a racist, I did not mean to harm that man in any way. So she's saying she's not a racist, but Elliot Williams, legal analyst, wrote that when she threatened to call the police, she was leveraging her social power. She was letting Christian know that she was leveraging her social power as a white woman against him in public space, using the powers of the state, or saying her intent to use the powers of the state against him. So she invoked the institution, the use of the institution against him, and that could have had racist consequences. And so that's what Elliot Williams is saying here, is that whether she is racist or not is irrelevant. Who knows? The question is, what was the impact of her racist action? So I think this incident really, and this a reflection ties in nicely with what Kendi is arguing, that we need to look at the outcomes in order to get at the heart of racism. This piece I'll mention briefly, this scenario also can be useful for further discussions of the intersection of race, gender, socioeconomic status, and class in public space. And Kendi has chapters devoted to all of these things. So again, I use that example because Cooper is saying that is disavowing personal racism. And this kind of statement is somewhat normal and normalized for white Americans in the United States. And it clearly is not solving issues of broad racial disparities based on race and ethnicity. Okay. Right, so it doesn't seem entirely genuine. It seems very unclear that her quasi-apology seems very unclear about what actually happened there. Certainly not taking responsibility, but also shows this tendency to say it's not about my personal, in my heart beliefs, really distracts from what Kendi says we should focus on, which is group outcomes. And in summarizing how he presents this to us, I'm saying if group outcomes are inequitable, then racist policies are creating those outcomes. Okay, Kendi's saying if group outcomes are inequitable and it's not the fault of policy, then it must be the fault of the group. And that's unacceptable, right? That's what racism is, saying that group outcomes are somehow natural or inevitable. Okay, so he's focusing on policy, and the policy is any measure, a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity. I find this statement very compelling. I thought about it a lot, that he said there's no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. And it helps us to think about how many policies and regulations and guidelines and legal procedures have consequences for disparate racial impact that are not, and those policies aren't explicitly about race. Okay, so we have some policies that are explicitly about race, seeking to create unequal outcomes, such as an immigration policy that biases some nations over another, or some class status over another, intersecting with race or nationality. We also have policies that attempt to undo racial differential racial or ethnic outcomes. So, fair housing laws, fair employment laws, degree to which they're enforced is another policy question, but those purposefully address race, attempt to address racial inequity. Okay, but most policies don't talk about race or immigration, race or ethnicity. And Kendi is saying we need to look at those. We need to look at the outcomes and then look at the policies and say what are driving these outcomes. So in conclusion here, and this is my final slide, Kendi argues that there's no such thing as a non-racist, and there's no such thing as a non-racist policy, that either our ideas and our actions and our policies support the case that people are equal across racial and ethnic groupings, or we don't. Okay, so that's a choice that we need to make. And public policy is about making choices. Okay, You have to find where the money's coming from. Where is it going? How will it be distributed? Who's in charge of enforcement? We need to make choices, and are those choices going to reflect the values that we say we have, or are they not? A hopeful conclusion I take away from Kendi's first chapter in the book is that racial equity is achievable, something that I don't think I have really read before, which is astounding, but it's clearly important that he is saying it and writing it. It is achievable through anti-racist policy and action. And I just wanted to highlight that it means that racial inequity is not inevitable in our society. It's certainly not inherent. And that is the main point. It's a choice, and we can do something about it. Thank you.